Science fiction is full of meetings between the human species and so-called extraterrestrial life. That life may be sentient, technologically equal to, or most likely advanced when compared to humanity's backward cultural and technologically stunted... I digress. Examples of this sort of advanced alien encounter can be found in almost every Star Trek and Star Wars episode, and countless other stories by authors going as far back as H.G. Wells' 1897 The War of the Worlds. On the flip side, that first meeting is between humans and a life form that shows no outward technology, but reacts on instinct for survival and perpetuation of their species. These aliens are more bug-like, plant, fungus, and the like. Consider movies like Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, The Blob, Alien, Starship Troopers, Day of the Triffids, and others. In today's episode of Musings of an Earthbound Alien, I'm going to look at the sci-fi idea of first contact and how humanity would, or might, not only react, but the consequences of that reaction. I'm also going to touch on the real-world examples of first contact, and only touch on them, mind you. We've already, in real life, gone through many first contacts with an advanced culture, and it hasn't always gone well. Don't worry, I'm not going to look at the moral issues that some countries and groups are facing right now regarding first contact. That's for another episode. Stay tuned, I'll be right back.
Origin unknown. Motives? Therein hangs the tale. For in just a moment, we're going to ask you to shake hands figuratively with a Christopher Columbus from another galaxy and another time. This is The Twilight Zone.
In the Twilight Zone episode, To Serve Man, originally broadcast in March of 1962, we see how one possible outcome of first contact can go. The story, To Serve Man, was first written in 1950 by a U.S. author, Damon Knight, and first appeared in the November 1950 issue of Galaxy Science Fiction. The story is about an alien race that comes to Earth with an offer of peace. While initially wary of the aliens, who just sort of showed up, world leaders at the United Nations were persuaded to accept the peaceful intentions of the aliens. They accepted the advanced technology, the end to hunger, a global energy solution where everyone had ample and free energy, and of course, the end to the global arms race. However, this love affair with the peaceful benefactors of the human race is jarred when Patty, a member of the cryptography staff led by our lead character and narrator of the story, decodes the title of one of the aliens' books that was left.
Don't get on that ship! The rest of the book, To Serve Man, it's a cookbook!
Just as a point of interest, the genre of science fiction, also called speculative fiction, has been around since the early 1600s. 1616 is when the first published science fiction story, or what was considered a science fiction story, was a German tale called The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz by Johann Valentin Andreyev. I probably butchered that name, and I do apologize to his ancestry. I should confess at this point that I haven't actually read the story, just a bit of the synopsis, and even that seems a bit vague. It's a bit too esoteric for me and is more about alchemy than actual science. Keep in mind that alchemy isn't really a true science. But in the 1600s, alchemy was considered a science. There's also some debate as to what the real first sci-fi novel was. Adam Roberts, a professor at Royal Holloway and a science fiction novelist, suggests that because alchemy isn't about science and more about magic, The Chemical Wedding is not really science fiction. Personally, while I'm sure it's a fascinating debate, it's getting a bit off topic, and my apologies for that. Which brings me to the second salient point. I'm not going to include so-called superhero stories in this episode. Yes, I know that we could allow for them to be considered, but I'm not going to. For this episode, I'm only looking at what I could consider hard science fiction that has nothing to do with a comic book superhero. I consider that a separate genre altogether, and since this is my show, my rules. Yuval Noah Harari, author of the best-selling science fiction books Sapiens and Homo Deus, suggests that science fiction is, and I quote, the most important artistic genre. It shapes the understanding of the public on things like artificial intelligence and biotechnology, which are likely to change our lives and society more than anything else in the coming decades, unquote. Even if you've never read a science fiction book or seen a sci-fi movie, and no matter what your age, you have actually been influenced by the genre. Science fiction, in general terms, is a key tool in shaping public opinion. It influences industry and governments alike on many levels. As a real-world example, AI, or artificial intelligence, robots and robotic engineering, are sci-fi inventions. Granted, in many of the sci-fi stories that contain an AI theme, the plot focuses on when a computer program or a robot achieves consciousness and begins to get the idea that removing the human element is not such a bad idea because the human element is seen as a threat. All hail Skynet. The earliest robot was first created in 1954 by George C. Devol, an inventor from Louisville, Kentucky. He invented and patented a reprogrammable manipulator called Ultimate, and that was a real world example. But the first story in science fiction was Lyman Frank Baum's children's novel Ozama of Oz in 1907. It was the first time we see the introduction of a human-like mechanical man. That was 15 years before the term robot was even used. AI is the same. It was first used in novels and short stories of speculative fiction authors for years before anyone came up with the idea that a real-world computer could be created to think and act for itself, mostly as part of a robotic brain, but you get the idea. My point is that creative, imaginative, and inventive writers of speculative fiction are really the progenitors of that far-out and sometimes far-fetched ideas that make its way into government and corporate policy, whether you like it or not. The geeks and nerds that you bully and beat up in schools are the ones that you need to be nice to, not the jocks and the cheerleaders. Now, I don't want to get too much into the topic of science fiction itself, or at least the digestion of science fiction, but I want to use it as a vehicle for the topic of first contact, and look at how humanity might handle such an event. Let's face it, humans have had a terrible reputation with first contact situations over the past few thousand years. From the Vikings to almost every country in Europe, and yes, whether you like it or not, England, you are included in the European list of peoples that have had first contact situations go wrong. This is a currently sensitive subject for many today, and it requires a show of its own to deal with as far as the moral aspects of first contact and what went wrong. For those reasons, I'm not going to get into the specific details of colonization, the good or the bad. But I'm going to glance on the topic because it fits with today's subject of first contact and how it doesn't seem to go well for one side or the other. In science fiction, we could look at countless examples of how badly first contact went, and not just for the human side. H.G. Wells' example of first contact, War of the Worlds, went badly for both the human species and the alien invaders. Spoilers, they get a cold and all die. I am, of course, simplifying it quite a bit here, mostly because I want to keep this as short as I can. In the real world, on this planet over the centuries, it was generally the more technologically complex societal groups that are able to travel the vast distances required to make first contact with those more isolated, less technologically developed peoples. First contact examples as far back as when we climbed down from the trees in Africa and moved out into the wider world. There are even examples of interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern human, Homo sapiens. Look in the mirror, that's you. When one group met with another group, cultural contact, or contact between peoples with different cultures, usually led to a change in both systems. If that system was voluntary, where one group borrowed traits or ideas from the other, then we can consider that relatively positive contact. But more often than not, cultural, fossil, and written records show that first contact was more of a forced integration of one group over another. When one group is conquered by another and must abide by the stronger group's customs, emphasis on the word stronger. There may have been an attempt at assimilation. Yes, resistance is futile, for we are the Borg. But the process where groups of different cultures were forced to blend with the dominant culture of a society is widely written about in our collective history. Asia, Europe, the United States, Canada, every so-called enlightened and educated human culture had policies designed to face the assimilation of native and indigenous peoples. There were, most notably, laws that mandated that indigenous children attend residential or boarding schools. This assimilation not only included the various governments, but the religious, education, and medical institutions. Indigenous adults were jailed, forcibly sterilized, placed in re-education camps, and basically treated as property and lower in status than livestock or cattle. This idea of first contact and the consequences, possible consequences, is so strong in our collective literature that over the span of human exploration, it continues today as a trope in science fiction, except that in sci-fi it manifests itself as extraterrestrial first contact. It is also clearly evident in contemporary space exploration. For example, the Pioneer plaque on Pioneer 10 and 11 intended to welcome or greet an extraterrestrial race of beings that may one day come across in our little welcome card. It includes a map that leads them straight to Earth. I'm still not completely sure that was a good idea, and I might mention that again. Today, establishing contact with so-called uncontacted peoples is still attempted despite the negative effects. Just look at the indigenous group that lives deep in the Amazon, the jungles along the rivers and the unexplored portions of the Amazon. Family and communal groups that are so deep in the rainforest that modern humans have never traveled. The modern record of first contact with these groups have been devastated. Very few of these uncontacted groups survive prolonged exposure to modern society and our way of life. Many succumb to the diseases that we've become acclimatized to, murdered for their land by unlawful logging or farming, lost to family when taken away for supposed study, and even suffer from the mental stress of having their entire way of life ripped apart by modern technology and modern humans. The educated and culturally aware among us will not fail to notice that the historical record indicates that when one culture is significantly more technologically advanced than the other, that side will be favored by the disruptive nature of the conflict, often with dire consequences for the other society. We also find that the more isolated peoples, the ones who lived in the broader territories with a low-density population, seem to succumb to the illnesses and problems brought from the comparatively higher density life of the invaders. The indigenous populations didn't have the time to develop immunities or an understanding of the foreign or cultural upheaval brought on by first contact. That simple knowledge that we were not alone could and did have a massive effect on every aspect of life. Granted, the invaders, colonizers, explorers, alien conquerors, whatever you want to call them, did not get off without some disturbance in their own cultures. But the effect or influence on life was far from traumatic. It should be noted that there are many important instances of human versus human first contact that have occurred without a detailed, for that matter, contemporary recording across the planet. However, we do know that many of them include in the 330 BC invasions of Alexander the Great from Persia to India and the establishment of Roman Chinese relations in the 2nd century AD show that during that time, the well-established trade routes from prehistoric times meant that many of the cultures would have been at least aware of the other before they actually met, thus reducing the negative consequences of first contact. Of course, I'm not referring to any of the many out-and-out wars fought during that same period among city-states and perceived empires. Now that I've touched on the human consequences of human-to-human first contact, what about the main subject at hand? Alien first contact with us lowly humans. Can humans survive first contact with an alien race or ethos? I'm going to start with the premise that we can take our own lived experiences to heart as we use it as a measuring stick in how we would or wouldn't survive in our own extraterrestrial first contact experience. Oh, and just to be clear, I'm going to look at it as if we were contacted by ET here on Earth. I'm not going to scrutinize first contact from a human exploration scenario, but we'll sort of look at it as a separate chapter, but not in any great detail. That said, I do have some thoughts, and I will present them here. As a teaser, however, I'll say that I see a dual aspect to the result. Let's break this examination down into 4 easily scrutinized parts. Cultural, including religious and perceived status of where we are in the universe. Educational, military, and religion. As far as the cultural aspect is concerned, since climbing down from the trees, humans have supposedly been on an evolutionary upward path for the past 2.5 million years, give or take a few thousand years. We've successfully occupied all the major geographic regions of the planet, mostly. Keep in mind there are still some unexplored regions. But let's say, for example, outside of the extreme climates of Antarctica and parts of the North Pole, our ancestors used their primitive and early cultural knowledge and technology to make it possible for them to begin living in a subarctic region of the Northern Hemisphere. Mind you, the fossil and anthropological evidence does show it took 1 million years plus of effort, out of extreme necessity to move into those parts of the world. About 500,000 years ago, primitive humans caught on to the need to reinvent itself and adapt to more efficient hunting skills, fire use, clothing, shelter improvements, in housing, agricultural, and commerce. Culture has been a highly successful adaptive mechanism for our species. It has given us a major selective advantage in the completion and the competition for survival with other terrestrial life forms. Culture has also allowed the global human population to grow from less than 10 million people shortly after the end of the last ice age to more than 6.5 billion, give or take 500,000. People today, a mere 10,000 years later, we haven't done that bad. Sort of. Culture has also made us the most dangerous and most destructive large animal on our planet. It's ironic that despite the power that culture has given us, we're totally dependent on it for survival. We need our cultural skills to stay alive. There is little doubt that human cultural skills have been a strong tool for our survival. However, human culture is not singular. Modern evolutionary study of human origins, within some academic circles anyways, continues to reflect the belief that there are an essential human nature that thrives throughout the species, that the basic nature of all peoples share a common cultural root. While this may have been true of some evolutionary branches of early human existence, I doubt we can say this is the reality today, or of the past several 100,000 years. As humans and pre-humans started to spread out in the world, divisions in our shared cultures began to show and grow. Remember that human beings aren't so much influenced by culture as we also create the culture. Those divisions in pre-modern humans and Homo erectus, as we spread, we saw familial or family groups, extended family, neighborhood groups become small tribes, expanded into collectives, and on and on. In each expansion, the cultural norms and expectations morphed and grew and shaped individual and group collective behaviors. In effect, this is how we created those initial missteps in first contact over the past few thousand years of human-to-human first contact experiences. Today, what we have is a planet of human beings who think that we're at the top of the food chain, each with their own belief in their own superiority. We currently have about 195 separate and totally individual countries on Earth, and each one of those have their own way of life, with divisions that include religions, linguistic, ethnic grouping, arts, political, institutional aspects, each one with various codes of dress, manners, rituals, norms, behaviors, laws, morality, and systems of belief around right and wrong. And within each one of these 195 countries, we have divisions upon divisions upon divisions within that same system. And each one of these divisions have a label to identify, codify, classify, verify who and what we are. As a species, humans have labeled ourselves to death. We've created labels for every aspect of our cultural norm that defies us, shapes us, guides us, it secludes us, it excludes us, it includes us, and it confuses us. We have used every aspect of our societal cultures that we have created and made up. And when that wasn't enough, we added our own geographic divisions to create even more cultural, linguistic, political divisions. Every so-called Great War, every internal conflict, every major event in human history has given us the perceived impetus to draw and redraw and re-redraw lines on a map to separate us even further. And everything we've done for the past 500,000 years as a species, the artificial divisions we've created amongst ourselves, has only made it easier for E.T. to swoop in and have lunch. And yes, we're the lunch, the food stock that seems to want to be used as a meal.
Mr. Chambers, don't get on that ship. The rest of the book, To Serve Man, it's a cookbook.
We've culturally divided ourselves to the point that any alien race with the technological capabilities to travel hundreds, if not thousands of light years would have no problem seeing us as either food or just not worth the effort to engage with our little group. There are so many differences and divisions within the species now that we are unable to come to any consensus on the equity of food, water, education, or a so-called right to exist. Humans have gone to war over the simplest of things for hundreds of thousands of years. Language, religion, imaginary borders drawn on a piece of paper, the color of one's skin, the way one dresses, political aspirations, so-called tribal divisions, economies, customs, technological capabilities, food, water, xenophobia, and on and on and on. Imagine, if you will, smart enough, technologically superior aliens come into Earth. What country or government do they contact? Where do they land? Those two questions alone, and our inability to answer them in a realistic, cohesive, unified manner, would throw this planet into a catatonic-like state. You can't go to the United Nations because the United Nations are only representatives of the various governments on the planet. The Security Council on the United Nations currently has an inability to function as a cohesive group, and they're supposed to be the leaders, really. The Security Council has 5 permanent members: China, France, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Any one of them can veto a resolution. It makes the other members, who have no veto whatsoever, that make up the Security Council, incapable of passing any real resolution or exerting any real influence over the 5 permanent members. It makes the entire United Nations and the Security Council as a subunit completely incapable of group thought. Can you imagine ET trying to speak at the United Nations? Can you imagine the conflict it would create if any one of the Security Council permanent members, or for that matter, anyone in the United Nations at all, think that if ET landed in the US or in Russia or in China, it would give that country an unfair advantage or dominance over the rest of the planet? Of course it would drive people completely insane within the United Nations. Human nature has always been mistrustful, and we would be incapable of trusting any other country acting as host to ET. We are so paranoid of just about every aspect of humanity and every other group's intent that we would go to war before we accept that other country wouldn't try and use the technological advantage that may or may not come from a first contact experience with an alien race. Humans think themselves superior, but just from a cultural aspect, human beings are not at the top of the food chain. We are the food chain for that extraterrestrial group. Conclusion: we are not going to come out of any first contact looking good or alive. Tasty, maybe.
Mr. Chambers, don't get on that ship. The rest of the book, To Serve Men, it's a cookbook.
As far as the educational piece, amongst most, unfortunately not all, human groups, education is accepted as a fundamental human right. This was even voted on by the Nations Convention of Human Rights, first published in December 1948 as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then amended over the years. These two supposedly groundbreaking documents, co-opted and grouped with the Convention of the Rights of Children, adopted in 1989, sets out how education, as a fundamental human right, would uplift the have-not third world or developing countries to a higher status to compete directly with the so-called first world or developed nations, putting humanity supposedly on an equal footing. It was a nice concept, a wonderful piece of human ideals and thoughts about how other humans would help each other to grow. By the way, as a side note, only 48 countries voted in favor of the declaration in 1948, and over the interceding years, not much has changed. 8 countries abstained, and 2 did not vote at all back in 1948. And as I said, in the interceding years, where multiple countries began to exist and joined the United Nations, the declaration did not change much regarding what countries did or did not support it. I'm not going to get into that, into which ones did or didn't support it right now, but maybe I will later on. And human beings, being human beings, means none of the declaration has any real meaning anymore. Not that I thought, even back when I was in school and learned about it, that it was going to do anything. That was, of such importance that individuals in society, indeed most countries, they thought basic education is perceived not only as a right, but also as a duty. Governments are typically expected to ensure access to basic education, while citizens are often required by law to attend education up to a certain basic level. There was a point that we saw global literacy rates climb. There was, in fact, hope. However, what we've ended up with in the past 100 years it was a hodgepodge of standards. Funding and commitment. We have segregation barriers. We've included race segregation, religion, sex, ethnic, language, and other divisions in class and status. We've experienced inadequate funding models, creating scandals, lack of nutritional access, sexual predators, racial and ethnic profiling, residential schooling and assimilations of indigenous groups, and wholesale removal of basic education for girls and women, and even the murder of teachers and the kidnapping of students. And this goes on today. And while some countries have seen more of these issues on a regular basis, some of the stated problems can be found in every single country on Earth. These inadequacies and glaring issues and differences in education around the world tend to influence those in society with inadequate education and on their belief systems and how they respond to changes in a fear and in a far more drastic manner than those where a higher education and access to these resources prevail. Examples of this problem and how it might affect a first contact situation can be found in countries and regions of developing countries, and for that matter, even within fully developed so-called first world nations, where the level of superstition and the belief in the supernatural and an over-reliance on religious customs taint how individuals and cultures view the idea of a human's place in the universe. These places and these groups are typically more xenophobic, mistrustful, and fearful of anything different. They tend to place a higher relevance on gods and deities and superstition and become very anxious and fearful of science. If, for example, you haven't figured it out yet, yes, I'm directly equating the lowering of a global education standard and literacy to that of the rise in fundamental religious groups, societal groups, and cultural groups into such shock and disbelief and fear that there is an extremely high risk of mass violence and protest breaking out around the world. Keep in mind that I'm not saying that fully educated and well-educated individuals would not be fearful and thrown into a mass panic-like situation. Of course, that's a concern. However, what I am saying is that these countries with lower literacy skills, even in places like the U.S., which has drastic differences between school boards and regions within the U.S. itself, I believe that on a global scale, students are taught or were taught in areas that do not have adequate funding for education or have extreme religious right-wing fundamental teachings will see a greater amount of panic meeting that extraterrestrial. Clearly, there is more to this subtopic than I give it credit for, and the lack of educational standards on a global level needs to be addressed by local, provincial, or regional and national governments. I just don't see that happening anytime soon. Conclusion, we are not going to come out of any first contact situation looking good or alive. Now we can look at the military aspect. The military angle is one where one would think obvious. Let's face it, ET comes to Earth, and one of the first groups to be involved will be the military. But that brings up a few, let's say, special human issues. And depending on the country or region that our alien visitors land, it's sure to involve a slightly different military response. The traditional human fears will certainly kick into high gear, and like just about every alien first contact or movie or show, there is the local military general that wants to come out guns ablazing and, I quote, tear these alien bastards a new one. A very quick cultural review, totally on scientific review, of course, tells me that these countries with extreme right or left political leanings, where the lines between government leadership and the military hierarchy are, let's say, blurred, and the word elections and civil rule are four-letter words that may get you shot or tossed in the hoosgow, jail for all you non-cartoony folks. will be the ones that would lead the charge in attacking ET even before the ship has landed. I strongly suspect that places where the military would shoot first and never bother with questions is one where they feel their fiefdoms, their thrones are threatened. You really can't have a dictatorship without thinking everyone is out to get you. If our alien friends, invaders, tourists, refugees, hungry exploiters, I'll swing back to that in a few minutes, if our alien visitors land in or communicate with more, let's say, advanced Western countries, and yes, while not backed or Western blocked, I am including Russia and China, there may be more of a pause between a what the hell is that and the order to fire everything we've got. According to most first contact movies and shows, we could expect to see a few well-informed but befuddled scientists from various disciplines that are never really explained in the script, and the political leadership trying to communicate with ET. Maybe a few flashing lights on a helicopter or an organ playing on a mountaintop with a large light board flashing multicolored lights for no particular reason or functional anything. Or maybe an attempt to touch ET's ship with a scary hazmat suit while holding up signs written in English. At some point, though, you know that someone in some back room will be eager and ready to press the button, pull the trigger, and nuke the bastards. Military leadership at the higher levels tend to be more a cautious bunch and see everything as a threat. Not that they're wrong, and having a threat level appropriate response is a prudent survival concept. It is at this point, I would hope, that a well-reasoned research, multidiscipline, international scientific approach to contact can be conveyed to the civilian leadership, and that this avenue of first contact is attempted before we, quote, rip the alien bastards a new one. However, militaries around the world have a microcosm of society and as such are prone to the typical failings of human societies. Fear of the unknown, xenophobia, paranoia, exclusionary racism, gung-ho, gun-toting hillbillies from a bygone age of human frailty all exist in militaries around the world and in all ranks, from the lowly recruit right up to the highest generals and Field Marshal for life data. Sorry, I got carried away for a moment. At some point, the alien mothership will have a hatch move, a light wink on and off, a venting or purging of some unknown gases, and a trigger-happy trooper, underpaid, underappreciated, undernourished, and overworked and overhyped, will pull the trigger and let loose the dogs of hell. And that'll be it. That's at this point that ET, having traveled through the cosmos, endless void of space, and say, Mother Puss Bucket, and begin to disgorge the armada of well-armed alien troops with lasers or pulse rifles or sharp sticks, or a giant robot or a few billion tiny human-eating robots, or some alien virus or even a giant alien bug-like creature that will careen unabated across the land and devour the human race and everything in its path. All because we wanted to tear them a new one. Or that's what ET came for in the first place, and they had no intention whatsoever to strike up a chat with us. No 900 alien booty calls, no advanced medicines to cure cancers, the common colds, or hemorrhoids. No bringing together the human race in a never-before utopia of mankind. Look up the word, it's a real thing, and as sexist as it sounds, it's just an older word. Now, would our collective militaries even stand a chance against an arguably more advanced race? Maybe, but that depends on why we're being visited. Friends, invaders, tourists, refugees, farmers. I guess ET could be any one of those things. If our alien visitors are refugees, they're likely came here unarmed, or at least with the intention of not taking over and conquering the human population. At least I hope they're not armed. But if our visitors arrive in some other intent, then they're likely to be here with something a bit more lethal than a sharp stick. And any alien race that can build, crew, navigate, and travel through the vast voids of interstellar space will most likely have something in their arsenal that could and would rip us in half and just tear the face of the planet to sunder in very short order. The other problem I see with our military options, at least in the short term, is that every country will be throwing what they have at the invade and hoard on their own. No one will race to defend the other guy, and I say the other guy in air quotes. It'll be everyone for themselves. As a student of history and human stupidity, I know that the inability for human cooperation will hamper any coordinated effort to repel the invaders. Our collective history is ripe with examples. Part of the reason Europeans managed to overrun many indigenous peoples during the heyday of human colonization is that local indigenous tribes, groups, families were also warring against themselves. Nothing was ever peaceful in human history. Some formed alliances with the colonizers to defeat their perceived ancestral enemy rather than coming together to repel, which both sides in the end saw as invaders. Look at the French and English wars in North America. Canada, for those south of the 49th, each war and faction had a native group helping them fight against the other. The U.S. had the same thing happen as white settlers spread out from the East Coast areas into the plains and into the West. Some local indigenous tribes fought with the settlers to drive off the tribes they weren't friendly with. When the conquistadors landed in South America, rather than band together to drive the Spanish back into the sea, some Inca tribes formed alliances with the Spanish to wipe out lesser tribes. Countries taking sides or just sitting on the side, waiting to see how another would fare. Look at Europe during the Napoleon Wars. Not every country jumped in to defend its neighbors. Some waited to see which way the wind blew. We saw the same individual, selfish, one-sided, linear thought pattern across the world every time one group colonized another. Asia, Africa, India, it didn't matter. The same scenario played itself out. Even in the 20th century, this still occurred. World War I and II, we saw this happen. In both wars, the U.S. chose to stay out of the conflict that was clearly engulfing the world's major countries and taking the smaller ones with them. It wasn't until they were directly affected that they figured, oh, well, maybe we should get involved. That policy of so-called neutrality by countries throughout human history has only been a self-indulgent way of avoiding responsibility. No, I'm not singling out the U.S., but they suit my needs for an example here. My point is, if push came to shove, the military option in a first contact situation would not necessarily bring about a united, cohesive effort to repel the borders.
Stop all engines. Repel borders.
The other more obvious issue with any human pushback against an alien visitor bent on using us as livestock is that of military superiority. Don't forget, we've only barely left our planet and not very far. In the grand scheme of things, we're still in diapers and as a species haven't even begun to crawl. While other species might be older and, I hope, wiser and far more technologically advanced, with enough tech to allow them to roam the galaxy and travel between the stars. If you think E.T. is coming to Earth unarmed, you're nuts and a bit on the naive side. No culture able to leave their world and knowing how harsh it is in the void will go out without some sort of armament. As a Canadian Armed Forces veteran and one that keeps up on the current state of militaries around the world, I can tell you that we are screwed. Our weapons, while seemingly powerful, is most likely only powerful against our own kind and other human armor. Against ET, I'm not so sure. Take the fact that any interplanetary ship or ships will have to withstand massive amounts of radiation and other natural dangers in space that we can't even imagine. That tells me our weapons would most likely be completely useless. Our own spacefaring efforts can't even create armor on spaceships to protect them from something as simple as micrometeorite strikes, or our own space junk, which is horrendous for that matter. The International Space Station is at constant threat from that, and we've seen what happens when micrometeorites strike. It's happened before, and it's only a matter of time before the ISS runs out of luck. If you think that we could go up against an alien invader, you're delusional. Our Earthbound weapons were never designed to take on ET, and in the extreme nuking of them, that's likely, it's probably a bad idea, a really bad idea. Think about that option for a second. We use nukes, then another country used nukes. Where are we going to end with all those nukes being fired? We won't be able to go anywhere. We won't be safe from our own nuclear bombs. ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, sub-launched and land-based, artillery, tanks, rocket launchers, small arms. You know, I've seen what they can do against human armor, but I still don't think it would work well against any alien horde. And even if we were able to inflict some damage, I'm about still 90% sure that we'd never be able to do it quickly enough or make a difference in the outcome. And in the 10% chance that we actually won a battle or even the war against the aliens, we'd leave this planet in complete ruins anyways, to a level that the few surviving humans would only have a limited amount of time left alive, or at a state where we've knocked ourselves back to the Stone Age, where the infrastructure is not enough to keep us alive. Conclusion, we're not going to come out of any first contact looking good or alive. Where have I heard that before? Now, this brings us to religion. As I said before, I see a global organized and quasi-religion as the biggest obstacle to any successful extraterrestrial first contact. Full disclosure, I am an atheist. I do not subscribe to any religion of any kind, but living in Canada, where you have the right to practice safe religion customs, I will defend your right to that religion. I'm even willing to have interest in discussions on the topic of religion. Not that you're going to appreciate my arguments on why I dislike all religions. You'll notice that I also use the word safe religious customs. This is because I have seen some religions and religious customs that are incredibly unsafe and dangerous on several levels, mostly for women and children. I'm not going to go into these right now, other than to mention that they exist whether you like it or not. That is a reality of human culture. There are approximately 4,300 religions around the world today. This is according to Adherents, which is an independent, non-religiously affiliated organization that monitors the number and size of the world's religions. Now, the top 20 largest religions in order of their numbers or believers that they have are Christianity, Islam, the non-religious, which include the agnostic or spiritual, Hinduism, Chinese traditional religion, Buddhism, primal indigenous African traditional and diasporic religions, Sikhism, Ajuchi, spiritualism, Judaism, Baha'i, Jainoism, Shintoism, Kaodea, and a bunch of others. I'm not even going to get into them because mostly I can't even pronounce half of them. But how is religion going to put us in more harm if we're visited by ET? Well, I'm glad you asked me that, because none of the major religions believe in ET. None of them think that ET, extraterrestrials, not only don't exist, but if we ever did come across a real alien, it would be an abomination, the devil's work, and all that crap. That causes two problems for the defense of humanity. The first is the reaction time, which is delayed while they sort out the complete collapse of their belief system. If aliens don't or can't exist because these people believe that humans are some sort of creation from some deity, it sets up an internal conflict in their whole structure. Some of these religions and groups would even push their followers to accept some sort of faith that ET is meant to have us for dinner as the main course. Some would be in such a catatonic state that they couldn't even react in any meaningful way. It's like deer caught in the headlights. The second issue is that many of these religions are so diametrically opposed to any interaction or cooperation with others that even against an alien horde, they would rather die or fight on their own rather than with anyone else. We have thousands of years of examples of human stupidity where one or more religions fought against another, for no other reason other than the other guys believed in a slightly different god or gods. Mistrust of one religious group over others runs so deep that I am 99.9% certain they would never be able to come together to fight off an invasion. And again, we've seen examples of this in our own recent history. During World War II, many Christians and Arabs actually turned Jews over to the Nazis for no other reason than they didn't like Jews. This is not going to change just because the planet is in a threat of annihilation by aliens on a first contact situation. Conclusion, we're not going to come out of any of the first contact scenarios looking good or alive. By now, I'm guessing that you've noticed a pattern in my assessment of the human reaction to first contact. I just don't see humanity faring well. Scenes of chaos, panic, hysteria following the detection of alien life, buildings crumbling, fires rage, riots break out, societies collapse, especially after alien life lands on Earth. But what if we find that alien life, out there in our limited exploration of space? We come across it. That prospect can be both good and bad, sort of. Now, hear me out. Prospect 1. We find some sort of alien microbial life on one of the planets or moons that we've sent limited robot explorers to. There's also first contact. I mean, that is in fact first contact, but with a non-sentient life form. And it's clearly in a limited way and kind of one-sided. It is microbial life after all. Or we find more complex life under, let's say, the ice of Europa and the massive oceans that lie beneath Europa. The possibility of life exists. Not necessarily intelligent, but more along the lines of sea life here on Earth. Either discovery will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that humans are not alone in the center of the universe, as many assume. But that would lead to human chaos? Yeah, that's a good question. Some of the more ardent believers in human superiority, and certainly that humans are the descendants or the creations of some god or gods, will certainly resent and reject any such find. They will refute any proven scientific evidence of life not of Earth, and their followers will never accept it. And there may be some protests over the find, but I don't believe it will be as crazy as if aliens landed on Earth. If they can claim that any other life form is not so-called intelligent life, they'll be, I think, relatively okay with that find. For the most part anyways. I mean, they'll come up with their own reasoning behind it that makes absolutely no sense except to them. Not that I personally think there's much intelligent life either on this planet to start with, but that's a different story. Now, prospect number 2. Some of the more intelligent humans that have created some remarkable machines and tools. Remember Voyager 1 and 2, Pioneer 10 and 11, New Horizons. These are all spacecraft that were sent out into the void to essentially explore the gas giants and further out. They are, for the human population that have had their heads in the sand or follow some dumbass reality show and know nothing, these are 5 interstellar probes basically launched by NASA into the void. So far, they're the only probes to have reached interstellar space or are near interstellar space and on a trajectory to leave our own solar system. There are some other probes launched towards deep space since then. Dawn, Parker, Solar Probe, Deep Space One, Ulysses, Lightsail 1. But these are nowhere near interstellar distances at this point in time. Of the 5 that are in or near interstellar space, they carry a message to any would-be alien race lucky enough to find them floating in the void. Pioneer carried a plaque, for example, with a pictorial message showing things that include the form of the 2 human sexes that inhabit Earth, and also the location of Earth in relation to our solar system. Voyager 1 and 2 carried golden records, gramophone discs, 33 long play RPM. Oy vey, why am I even explaining this? And of course, a record player of sorts to play the records. They feature the audio recordings of humans, some other animals, and encoded pictures of human beings, and again, a map of where we're located in the solar system. Anyone else see this as a bad idea? Let's say that some intelligent alien finds these human-launched space junk. They figure out our cute little roadmap and decide that humans look like a tasty meal, easy prey, or just want our resources. Or if we're lucky, the only thing they want to do is say hello and ask us to stop sending our space junk into space and to deal with our own garbage. If they take the time to come to Earth, we're back to a first contact scenario being on our home field. And I still don't see it as being any better with the same unfortunate result. And if that's how Earthlings are going to deal with the news that there's life, intelligent life beyond our Earth, why do we even risk looking for life? The only thing that you have to remember is that this is a thought exercise after all, a what if, with the result being based on our existing shared responses over the past few thousand years. Who knows? Maybe it won't be so bad after all. When humans do find evidence of alien life and intelligent life, maybe the human beings at the time will take a rather well-meaning view of the whole situation. Of course, I have been known to be wrong from time to time on occasion, so it might not be so bad. Either way, if a hostile armada showed up, while we wouldn't be happy, I also don't think we'll fare well. Equally, if a benevolent, or at least perceived benevolent life from the stars showed up, I think it won't end that well, this time because of our collective human stupidity. For as first contact is a common science fiction theme, there are some benefits to look at the hypothetical what-if scenario. If for no other reason, then we should be prepared on a global level for the possibility of life existing elsewhere in the universe. If we do find life, even microbial life, and we could confirm that, it will have a profound impact on the lives of many human beings. For, from the fact that it's their outright denial of its existence to violent protests as these anti-life, external life groups, whatever you want to call them. I see them even trying to lynch members of the engineering and scientific community that support such research into life outside of Earth. Look, full disclosure, yes, I believe that there is life and abundant life outside of Earth and, outside of our solar system. But I also don't think personally that they visited this planet because, well, quite frankly, we're a bunch of fucking morons. To say the nicest thing that I can say about humans at this point in time. But to think otherwise is the height of human vanity and arrogance. And given that the first meeting between humans and extraterrestrial life, or any sentient species, our first encounter needs to go well. I just don't see it happening that way. The human experience shows us that any two groups, in this case from 2 planets or moons, or even here on Earth between 2 different human cultures, our old fears and habits will kick in. In my opinion, xenophobia and our perceived threat to our terrestrial technology, religion, politics, and the changes to our science and understanding of the universe would be so profound that humanity en masse, will rebel. We just haven't prepared ourselves for the challenges brought on from an extraterrestrial contact. The direct physical and intellectual contact with ET on our civilization will be massive, and the implications of first contact with ET, particularly with a technologically superior civilization, needs to be explored based on how badly our own shared experiences have been. Well, that's it for today's episode, and I hope you enjoyed our little trip into the hypothetical. If you enjoyed the show, please show your support by liking on the YouTube channel and on Facebook. The more likes I get, the more I can monetize the channel and the better the shows become. That's the theory anyways. Don't forget to subscribe and share the YouTube channel or subscribe and share the Facebook page for updates and upcoming episodes. Thanks everyone, and stay safe.